Most people would quietly pay a fine and move on. But Pam Bondi wasn't most people. Imagine walking into a courtroom for what you expect to be a simple hearing, only to get blindsided by a hefty fine with no explanation at all. But here's the kicker. Instead of accepting her fate, Pam flipped the entire courtroom upside down. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from today. Pam Bondi walked into Tampa's courtroom 3B, feeling pretty relaxed. She'd been here dozens of times, just another ordinary day, as an experienced attorney handling routine matters. She sat down calmly, glanced at her notes, and didn't sense anything unusual at first. But then, Judge Raymond Dalton walked in, and she instantly knew something was off. Judge Dalton wasn't the type for small talk. Tall, commanding, with a graying beard and a presence that made people sit a little straighter, Dalton cut right to the chase. Without any warning, without any discussion, he dropped a bombshell. The court finds that the defendant is in violation of Local Statute 14B and is subject to a fine of $10,000, payable immediately. Just like that. No arguments, no defense, nothing. Even the city attorney across from Pam looked stunned. Pam stayed cool, but inside, her mind raced. This wasn't just unusual, it was outrageous. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Pam said calmly, "we haven't even begun the proceedings. I haven't presented my arguments." Dalton barely blinked, almost dismissive. "The arguments are irrelevant. The violation is clear." Pam knew exactly what this was. A power play. Dalton was making a statement, trying to put her in her place. But he'd chosen the wrong attorney. Pam leaned forward slightly, meeting Dalton's eyes. "If the law were so clear, we wouldn't even be here. I'd appreciate the opportunity to present my defense." Dalton's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice calm but firm. "You're welcome to try, Ms. Bondi, but the outcome will remain the same." Oh, this wasn't just about the fine anymore. This was personal. Pam wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who'd ever been railroaded by the system. She flipped a page in her folder, mostly for show, before hitting back, "Your Honor, in all my years practicing law, I've never seen a judge dismiss a defense before hearing it. I'd say that's unprecedented." The tension was thick now. Dalton's jaw tightened, clearly uncomfortable. He shot back, "This court isn't a place for theatrics." Pam smiled slightly, feeling the shift. He was irritated, and irritation meant opportunity. She leaned in, her tone confident and controlled. "Let's talk about Statute 14B. You say it's clear, yet multiple appellate cases have overturned fines due to its vague wording. Just last year, Reynolds versus Clearwater ruled that issuing fines without due process violates constitutional rights." Silence filled the room. Even Dalton couldn't hide his discomfort. But he pushed back. "Those cases aren't relevant here." Pam didn't blink. "Aren't they?" "Because the appellate court specifically stated that fines without evidentiary hearings violate constitutional protections. I'm sure you wouldn't want to ignore precedent, Your Honor." Dalton hesitated, his jaw visibly tightening. "Are you threatening this court with an appeal, Ms. Bondi?" She calmly smiled again. "I don't threaten. I cite the law." The courtroom murmured quietly. Dalton exhaled slowly, realizing he'd lost control. Reluctantly, he allowed Pam to present her defense. But just as she began, he called for an unexpected 15-minute recess. Pam knew exactly what was happening. He was regrouping, strategizing. This wasn't over yet. When Dalton returned, he wasn't alone. Judge Alan Whitaker, a senior judge, entered alongside him. Pam immediately recognized this wasn't normal. Whitaker calmly addressed her, clearly there to back Dalton up. "Ms. Bondi, you're suggesting this fine should be overturned due to procedural issues. Are you aware there's clarification allowing some judicial discretion?" Pam didn't flinch. "I'm aware, but the same clarification demands strict evidentiary standards. which haven't been met here. Then, Whitaker surprised her, calling Officer Brian Calloway, who'd issued the fine, to testify. Pam calmly stood, walked toward him, and asked, "Officer Calloway, did you document this violation with photographs or written evidence?" "No," Calloway admitted, visibly uncomfortable. "It wasn't necessary." Pam turned directly to the judges, her voice clear and powerful. "With no evidence, we have nothing more than subjective opinion. This contradicts the evidentiary standards clearly stated in appellate rulings. How can this court impose a fine based purely on assertion?" The silence was deafening. Dalton, visibly frustrated, took another recess, clearly stalling. When he returned, he shocked everyone by doubling down, stating, "The fine stands." Pam calmly but firmly replied, "Just so we're clear, are you officially stating a fine can be imposed without evidence, directly contradicting established appellate precedent?" Dalton hesitated. The city attorney looked uneasy. Pam pushed forward, speaking not just to Dalton, but to the entire courtroom. "Imagine the implications if we accept rulings based solely on assertion. That's not judicial discretion. It's unchecked power." Whitaker finally intervened, acknowledging the point. Dalton, cornered, had no choice. With obvious reluctance, he reversed his decision. "This court finds the fine doesn't meet the evidentiary threshold. The fine is overturned." Pam didn't celebrate openly. She simply nodded, knowing she'd defended not just herself, but everyone's rights in that room. As she packed her papers and walked out, Dalton called after her, "Ms. Bondi, I underestimated you." She smiled quietly, responding simply, "You wouldn't be the first." Outside the courtroom, Whitaker approached her quietly, admitting he'd been brought in to contain the situation. "Dalton doesn't like losing," he warned softly. "You've drawn attention today, not all of it friendly." Pam nodded, unshaken. Today she'd reminded everyone, especially those in power, that authority doesn't mean immunity from accountability. Standing your ground matters, asking questions matters, and no matter how high the position, no one is above the law. As Pam stepped into the bright afternoon sun, she felt the importance of what she'd done. She hadn't just won a case. She'd set a precedent. She'd reminded people that just because someone hands you a ruling doesn't mean you have to quietly accept it. If you liked seeing justice served, click on the video popping up now for another unforgettable courtroom battle you won't want to miss.